The day I handed over the deed to my lake house, the one my father built with his own hands in 1967, was the day I understood what my son had really married. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is not important. What matters is that I turned 68 years old on a Tuesday in October, and by that Friday, I was supposed to be living in a studio apartment in an assisted living facility 40 miles from everything I'd ever known. That was the plan, not mine. My wife, Ruth Ann, passed 2 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. She was the kind of woman who kept a handwritten recipe card for every dish she'd ever cooked, organized in a little tin box by season. After she died, I still open that box by season. After she died, I still opened that box sometimes, just to look. The lake house was ours. We'd spent 41 summers there. It sat on 3 acres of pine and red clay soil in the hill country of central Texas, with a dot my father-in-law helped me extend the year my son was born. The main house was paid off. There was also the property in San Antonio, a commercial lot Ruth Ann had inherited from her uncle, which we'd leased to a hardware distribution company for 22 years. That lease brought in just under $9,000 a month. Steady as a heartbeat. After Ruth Ann died, my son started calling more. At first I was grateful. He'd drive out on weekends with his wife. I'll call her what she is, my daughter-in-law, and they'd sit on the porch and talk with me about nothing important, which is its own kind of important when you're grieving. My son grilled steaks. My daughter-in-law brought wine she said was from a vineyard in the hill country, though I noticed the same label at the Kroger in Marble Falls a few weeks later. I didn't say anything. I was just glad not to be alone. It was my daughter-in-law who first brought up the power of attorney. Just as a precaution, she said in the gentle, practiced tone of someone who'd rehearsed the sentence. You've been through so much. Heaven forbid something happened and we couldn't help you quickly. I told her I had a lawyer, a man named Whitaker in Kerrville, who'd handled mine and Ruth Ann's affairs for 15 years. She nodded and smiled, and the subject dropped. It came back 3 months later, at dinner. My son this time. He was more direct. Dad, we just want to be prepared. Dad, we just want to be prepared. If you get sick, if there's an emergency, the lease payments, the property taxes on the lake house. We just want to make sure things don't slip through the cracks. He showed me a document. Said his lawyer had drawn it up. I told him I'd have Whitaker look it over. Whitaker's retiring, my son said. I already called. He's not taking meetings. I called Whitaker myself the next morning. He was absolutely taking meetings. He was planning to retire in 3 years. That was the first crack. I had Whitaker look at the document. He called me the following afternoon, his voice slow and careful the way it gets when he's choosing words. The power of attorney my son presented covered not just medical decisions but full financial authority, all assets, all accounts, including the ability to sell property on my behalf without my direct signature at each transaction, under a clause that said I had already consented to delegated authority for transfers up to. And this is the part that sat in my chest like a stone. $500,000. This was written by someone who knows what they're doing, Whitaker said, and not in your favor. I told him I hadn't signed it. Don't, he said. I didn't tell my son what I'd found. I went back to the lake house, and I sat on the dock at dusk, and I watched the water go the color of old copper, the way it does in October when the light comes in low and flat from the west. And I thought about my father building this place with a handsaw and a borrowed truck, and I thought, over my dead body. Over the next 6 weeks, I moved quietly. Whitaker helped me set up a revocable living trust. Both properties went into it. The trust, named Ruth Ann's sister, who lives in Albuquerque and who I've trusted since 1987 as successor trustee. The lease payments were redirected through the trust's account, which my son and daughter-in-law had no access to. I updated my will. I moved my personal savings, about $200,000, mostly from a life insurance policy and 30 years of careful living, to an account my son didn't know existed. I told him none of this. What I did instead was invite them for Thanksgiving. My daughter-in-law said they'd try to make it, but they had plans with her family. I said I understood. I drove out to Albuquerque and had Thanksgiving with Ruth Ann's sister. And we talked about the trust, and she looked at the documents. And when I drove back, I felt, for the first time since Ruth Ann died, like I wasn't standing in the middle of an open field waiting for weather. The phone call came in the second week of December. My son, not my daughter-in-law. That detail matters. Dad, I need to talk to you about something. His voice had a practiced seriousness, the kind you use when you've thought through what you're going to say. Go ahead, I said. I've been talking to a financial advisor about the lease property. We think, that you might be better off with the capital than with a monthly payment at your age. The tax situation with the estate, and if anything happened, you want to sell the San Antonio property, I said. A pause. I think it makes sense to at least look at it. I'll think about it, I said. I didn't think about it. I already knew what it meant. The following Friday, I drove into town for a doctor's appointment and some groceries. On the way back, I took the long road home, the one that goes around the north side of the lake. When I came up the private drive, I saw a truck I didn't recognize parked next to my son's SUV. It had a ladder rack and a logo on the door I couldn't read from a distance. My son's car, I recognized. My daughter-in-law's sedan was parked beside it. I sat at the end of the drive for a moment. Just sat there. My daughter-in-law was supposed to be at work. My son had told me on Tuesday he was going to Dallas for a client meeting through the weekend. He had not mentioned he was coming to the lake house. I had not been asked. I pulled off the drive into the grass under a stand of cedar elms where the truck couldn't be seen from the house. And I sat and I waited. 20 minutes later, the man from the logo truck came out of my house carrying what I recognized as the lock hardware from my back door. He loaded it in the truck bed. My son came out behind him and shook his hand. My daughter-in-law stood on the porch with her arms folded, watching. The man in the truck drove away. My son went back inside. My daughter-in-law took out her phone. I drove back down to the county road and parked at the little barbecue place that's been there since before I could drive, and I ordered a cup of coffee and sat at a picnic table in the cold, and I called Whitaker. The locks, I said. Changing them without your consent is trespassing, he said. Doesn't matter whose name is on what document. The trust supersedes it. You want me to call someone? Not yet, I said. Let me go back. You sure? I want to see their faces, I said. Whitaker laughed, low and short. Call me after. I drove back to my house. My house. I want to be clear about that. I parked in my spot, the concrete pad my father-in-law and I poured ourselves in 1989, and I walked up the front steps and tried the door. New lock. Didn't take my key. I knocked. I heard movement inside. A long pause. The door opened. My son was wearing a flannel shirt I'd given him 2 Christmases ago. He looked at me the way a man looks at a problem he thought he'd scheduled for later. Dad, he said, I thought you had a doctor's appointment. I did, I said. I'm back. We were going to call you. I'm sure you were. I looked past him into the living room. My daughter-in-law was standing near the kitchen doorway, her phone face down on the counter. The locksmith just left, I said. I watched him go. My son's jaw did something complicated. His wife went very still. There was a security concern, he started. A security concern, I said. About my house. That you addressed by replacing my locks. Without telling me. Dad. I'd like the new key, I said. We need to talk about some things first. I'd like the new key, I said again. Or I'm going to call the sheriff's department and report that someone changed the locks on my home without my consent. Which is what happened. So if you prefer that conversation, we can have it. I watched my daughter-in-law reach for her phone. I wouldn't, I said. I've already spoken with my attorney. She put the phone back down. My son gave me the key. We sat at the kitchen table. My kitchen table, where I'd eaten breakfast for 17 years, and they laid out what they believed the situation to be. They thought the trust was just a draft. They thought the property was still accessible. They thought the lease money was still running into my personal account. They thought they had weeks before I would figure any of this out. And they had intended to spend that time getting a real estate agent out to the lake house before I'd signed anything or had any reason to suspect. They had the real estate agent's card in a folder on the kitchen table, ready to go. My son did most of the talking. There were debts he hadn't told me about. His daughter-in-law's family had lent them money, significant money. And there were people, he said, looking to be repaid. He said it like I should feel sorry for them. I know you've been struggling, I said. You should have told me. Would you have helped? My daughter-in-law asked. I looked at her. I helped you. Every time you asked, including the $30,000 for the business expansion 3 years ago that I've never heard a word about since. She looked at the table. If you'd come to me, I said, and told me what was going on, I would have tried to find a way to help. That's what family does. Instead, you came out here and changed my locks. My son started to say something. I held up a hand. The trust is signed. Both properties are in it. The accounts have been restructured. Whitaker has copies of everything. If either of you attempts to file any document regarding my estate, any document at all, he'll know within 24 hours. That's already arranged. My daughter-in-law looked at my son. My son looked at his hands. I love you, I said to my son. I love you because you're Ruth Ann's boy, and because I watched you learn to swim in this lake, and because you are, despite everything that's happened in this room today, my child. But I am not confused. I am not forgetful. I am not a problem to be managed. And this house will be here when I'm gone. And what happens to it will be decided by me, not by a real estate agent whose card you had ready before I'd even come home. My son didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, I'm sorry, Dad. I don't know if he meant it. Some days I think he did. Some days I think he was sorry he got caught, which is a different thing entirely. My daughter-in-law said nothing at all. She picked up the folder with the real estate agent's card and she put it in her bag and they left before dark. That was 14 months ago. My son calls sometimes. Not often. We talk about surface things, the weather, the football season, a piece of news. We have not talked about what happened at the kitchen table. Not directly. I don't know if we ever will. It is a version of forgiveness that isn't the same as forgetting, and I think that's the one I'm working toward. The lake house is still mine. The lease on the San Antonio property renewed in September. Ruth Ann's sister came out for a week in the summer and we took the boat out 2 mornings in a row, which is something I hadn't done since Ruth Ann died. The morning light on that water, out past the dock where the pines come down to the bank and the herons stand in the shallows like they're thinking through something important. I'll take that over a studio apartment any day of the week. My father built this place with his hands. I intend to leave it the same way it came to me. Whole. I've had 14 months to sit with what happened at that kitchen table. And here's what I keep coming back to. None of it had to go the way it did. Not for them, and not for me. My son is not a bad person. I need to say that because I believe it. He made bad choices, one after another, and he let someone else's fear and appetite pull him further in than he ever should have gone. That's not the same as being bad at the core. But it's also not something I can pretend didn't happen. What I know now is that actions have weight. Every choice my son made, letting those months of debt pile up without a word, letting my daughter-in-law lead him somewhere he had to have known was wrong, driving out to my lake house on a Friday when he told me he'd be in Dallas, each one of those choices landed somewhere. Nothing just disappears. The world has a way of completing the circuit. I think about the man I was at, 35, 40. I was not always careful. I was not always honest. There were years when I cut corners I shouldn't have. Years when I told myself that the small deceits didn't count. I don't think what happened with my son is punishment for any of that. Life isn't a ledger kept by some authority keeping score, but I do think that the habits we build, the way we treat the people closest to us, the willingness to tell hard truths instead of comfortable lies, all of that compounds. It either builds something worth standing on, or it doesn't. My son watched me for 40 years. I hope I gave him more right examples than wrong ones. I genuinely don't know. What I do know is that when I called Whitaker the morning after I found that the document was fraudulent, I wasn't acting on impulse. I was acting on something I'd spent a long time building quietly. The habit of thinking before I moved, of not letting anger make the first decision. That's not a talent. That's a practice. It takes years of being wrong and noticing it and adjusting. It takes being willing to feel afraid and do the next right thing anyway. When I sat in that cedar elm shade watching the locksmith load my hardware into his truck, I was scared. My hands were not steady, but I knew what to do because I'd already done it. 6 weeks of careful, quiet preparation that nobody saw. That's what I'd want anyone to take from this. Not the revenge angle, not the satisfaction of watching a scheme fall apart. Though I'd be lying if I said there wasn't some of that. What I'd want is this: that you don't wait for a crisis to know where you stand. That you build the kind of character and the kind of clarity that holds when things get bad. That you stay sharp enough to see what's actually happening, even when you don't want it to be true. And that when the moment comes, you have the backbone to walk back up that porch and knock on your own front door. Ruth Ann used to say that the only things worth keeping were the ones you'd earned by being honest. She wasn't talking about property. She meant the kind of person you are at the end of a hard day when nobody's watching. I think she was right. I think she usually was. The lake is still there. The light still comes in low and copper-colored in October. Some things, if you protect them carefully enough, stay exactly as they should be.